The day we moved into the house, everything felt perfect. It was just what we had been looking for. A quiet, cozy home in a peaceful neighborhood, far enough from the city to feel like we could finally breathe, but close enough that we didn't feel completely isolated. Sarah and I had spent months searching for this place, and now that we had the keys, it felt like the beginning of something new, something exciting. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of unpacking, decorating, and getting settled. We painted the walls, hung up pictures, and rearranged furniture until everything felt just right. The house had that comforting, lived-in feel, the kind of place you could make memories in. At night, we would curl up on the couch together, laughing about how chaotic the move had been, planning what our life here would look like. But then, small things started to happen. At first, they were easy to brush off, little moments that we could rationalize away without too much thought. One morning, I came downstairs to find a cup sitting in the middle of the kitchen counter. I could have sworn I hadn't left it there the night before, but Sarah told me I was probably just tired and forgot. I believed her. It wasn't a big deal. Moving was exhausting after all, and we were still adjusting. A few days later, it happened again. This time, it was the remote control. We had left it on the coffee table when we went to bed, but the next morning, it was sitting on the windowsill. Maybe one of us moved it without thinking, Sarah suggested. I nodded, but there was a nagging feeling at the back of my mind that something was off. It wasn't until the third time that I started to worry. I had left my keys on the hook by the front door, where they always were, but when I went to grab them the next morning, they were gone. I searched the entire house, getting more and more frustrated, only to find them an hour later in the upstairs bathroom, sitting neatly on the sink. I knew for a fact that I hadn't taken them up there. Sarah swore she hadn't either. "That's weird," she said, her brow furrowed. "Maybe one of us moved them and forgot?" But I hadn't forgotten. I was sure of it. Something wasn't right. That night, as we sat on the couch, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The house felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more pronounced. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been in the house when we weren't paying attention. I didn't say anything to Sarah, though. I didn't want to scare her, and I didn't want to admit that I was scared too. The following week, things got worse. I started noticing more and more out-of-place items. Small, unsettling changes that didn't make any sense. Sarah's jewelry box had been moved from the dresser to the nightstand. A book I had left open on the table was now closed and tucked back on the shelf. The coffee maker, which we always turned off before bed, was running when I came downstairs one morning. We changed the locks, twice. It didn't help. One afternoon when Sarah was at work, I decided to search the house. I needed to know if there was some logical explanation for what was happening. I started in the basement, checking for any signs of forced entry or hidden doors. Nothing. I moved up to the attic, opening every box and inspecting every corner, but there was no sign that anyone had been there. But the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. That night, Sarah and I came home after a late dinner out. Everything seemed fine until we went into the bathroom. There, written in the condensation on the mirror, was a single word: "Hi." My stomach dropped. I stared at the message, my pulse racing. "Did you do this?" I asked Sarah, my voice trembling. She shook her head, her eyes wide. "No. Why would I?" We stood there in silence, staring at the mirror, neither of us knowing what to say. I could see the fear in her eyes, and I felt it too. Someone had been in our house, someone who knew exactly when we wouldn't be there. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept thinking about the mirror, about the small, strange changes that had been happening. How long had this been going on, and why hadn't we noticed sooner? The next morning, I decided to check the house more thoroughly. I went room by room, checking every window, every door. Everything was locked. Everything was exactly as it should be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here, moving things, leaving us messages, watching us. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was real. As I walked through the house, my skin prickling with unease, I stopped in the hallway. There, just above the picture frames on the wall, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tiny holes, barely visible, drilled into the corners of the ceiling. At first, I thought they were just part of the house's design, something I hadn't noticed during the move. But as I got closer, my heart sank. They were camera lenses. I stood frozen, staring at the tiny lenses embedded in the ceiling, my heart racing in my chest. How long had they been there? Had they been watching us this entire time? 1,000 questions flooded my mind, but none of them had answers. My mouth went dry as I backed away, trying to think clearly. I didn't want to tell Sarah. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But how could I keep something like this from her? Whoever had put those cameras in the house had been watching us, studying us, and the thought made my skin crawl. I felt violated, like every private moment had been stolen. I took a deep breath and went back downstairs. Sarah was in the kitchen, making breakfast, blissfully unaware of what I had just found. I tried to act normal, but she immediately noticed something was off. "What's wrong?" she asked, turning to face me, concern etched across her face. I hesitated, unsure of how to say it. "There are cameras in the house," I blurted out, my voice shaky. "I found them in the hallway, hidden in the ceiling." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "What? Cameras? Are you sure?" I nodded, running a hand through my hair. "Yeah, they're small, but they're there. I don't know how many more there are or who put them there, but we've been watched, Sarah." The color drained from her face as she processed what I had said. How is that even possible? How did we not notice? "I don't know," I admitted. "But whoever it is, they've been careful. They know when we're gone. They've been moving things, leaving messages. This isn't just random. They've been planning this." Sarah sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "What do we do? Do we call the police?" I wanted to say yes, that calling the police would solve everything. But deep down, I wasn't sure it would. Whoever was behind this had been so meticulous, so precise. It wasn't some random burglar sneaking into our house to steal things. It was someone with a purpose, someone who wanted to play with us. "I think we should check the rest of the house first," I said. "See how many more cameras there are. Then we can go to the police with everything." Sarah nodded, though she still looked pale and shaken. I could tell she was barely holding it together, and truthfully, so was I. But we couldn't let fear paralyze us. We needed to understand what we were dealing with. We spent the rest of the day searching the house, checking every room, every nook and cranny for more cameras. They were everywhere. In the living room, the kitchen, even the bedroom. Hidden so carefully that we had missed them for weeks. I felt sick knowing that every moment we had spent in this house, every private conversation, every intimate moment, had been watched by someone. By the time we finished, we had found nearly a dozen cameras, each one expertly placed in areas where we would never have noticed them unless we were looking. It felt like a nightmare, one that we couldn't wake up from. "Who would do this?" Sarah whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes wide with fear. "Why would someone watch us like this?" "I don't know," I said, sitting beside her. "But they've been careful. They've made sure we wouldn't notice until they wanted us to." The messages, the moving things around, it was all part of their game. "But what do they want?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What if they're planning something worse?" That was the question that terrified me the most. Whoever was behind this had already crossed so many boundaries. What else were they capable of? Were we just being watched, or were we in real danger? We didn't sleep much that night. Every sound, every creak of the house felt like it could be someone moving through the shadows. I stayed awake, listening for any sign that we weren't alone. But the house was silent, save for the faint hum of the appliances and the distant rustle of the wind outside. The next morning, I decided it was time to go to the police. We had enough evidence, photos of the cameras, the strange message on the mirror. But when I went to grab my phone to call them, it was gone. I searched the entire house, but it was nowhere to be found. "Did you move my phone?" I asked Sarah, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. She shook her head. "No, I haven't touched it. Where did you leave it?" "I had it right here, on the counter," I said, frustration building in my chest. "I know I did. It was here last night." We both searched the house, top to bottom, but it was gone. My phone wasn't the only thing missing. Sarah's laptop had disappeared too. It was as if someone had come into the house while we slept and taken the very things we needed to reach out for help. That's when the message came. On Sarah's phone, a single text from an unknown number. It read, "I see you." My blood ran cold as I stared at the words on the screen. Whoever it was, they were still here, still watching us, and they were making sure we knew it. The message on Sarah's phone felt like a punch to the gut. "I see you." The words stared back at us, taunting, as if whoever had sent it was sitting just out of sight, watching our every move. I could see the panic in Sarah's eyes, and I felt it too. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was real, and it was happening right now. "We need to leave," I said, my voice low, trying to keep calm for Sarah's sake. "Pack a bag. We'll go to the police station and stay somewhere safe tonight." Sarah nodded, already moving toward the bedroom closet. I grabbed my wallet and the few things we hadn't lost to the intruder. My mind raced as I tried to piece it all together. Whoever had been watching us wasn't just some voyeur. They had access to our home, to our lives. They had taken our phones, our laptops, they had left messages on mirrors, and now sent us a direct threat. And worst of all, they knew we were trying to get help. As Sarah and I moved quickly through the house, gathering what little we could, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in the house with us. The walls felt too close, the silence too thick. Every corner seemed to hide something sinister. It was as if the house itself was watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. And then we heard it, footsteps. They were faint at first, coming from somewhere upstairs, but unmistakable. My blood turned to ice as I realized we weren't alone. The intruder wasn't just watching us from a distance anymore. They were here, inside the house. Sarah froze, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the front door, but just as we reached it, we heard the sound again. Closer this time. Whoever was in the house was coming for us. We couldn't leave. Not yet. "Upstairs," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to find out who this is. We can't keep running." Sarah looked at me like I was crazy, but she didn't argue. We moved quickly, silently up the stairs, each step creaking beneath our weight. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the streetlights outside. As we reached the top, the footsteps stopped. The house was silent again, but the air was thick with tension. We checked each room one by one, but there was no sign of anyone. The intruder had vanished, leaving only the lingering sense of dread in the air. My heart raced as we reached the last room, the attic. The door was slightly ajar, and as we approached, I could feel the cold air seeping through the crack. I pushed the door open slowly, revealing the dark, musty attic. The air smelled of dust and decay, and the floor was littered with old boxes and forgotten belongings. But something was different this time. In the corner of the room, hidden behind a stack of crates, was a small, makeshift bed. A thin mattress on the floor, covered with a worn blanket. Someone had been living here. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the scene. My stomach churned as I realized the truth. The intruder hadn't been coming in and out of our house while we were gone. They had been here the entire time, hiding in the attic, watching us from the shadows. I moved closer to the bed, my hands shaking as I saw what was next to it. More cameras, carefully positioned to capture every angle of our home. And next to the cameras was a notebook, its pages filled with notes, drawings, and our names, our routines, our lives. "This can't be happening," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "They were here the whole time, watching us." I picked up the notebook, flipping through the pages. Each one was more disturbing than the last. Whoever had been living in our attic knew everything about us. When we left for work, when we went to bed, even the fights we'd had, the things we thought were private. They had been studying us, manipulating us. And then I saw it. A drawing. Crude but unmistakable. It was of me, standing in the living room, holding Sarah's hand. Above us, written in shaky, uneven letters, was a message: "You're not safe." I dropped the notebook, my mind spinning. This wasn't just someone watching us. This was someone planning something worse. Something dangerous. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Now." Sarah didn't argue this time. We turned and ran down the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. As we reached the front door, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the intruder standing there, watching us. But there was no one. We bolted out the door, the cold night air hitting us like a wave. I fumbled with the keys as we reached the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. Finally, we climbed inside, locking the doors behind us. I started the engine, my mind racing as I backed out of the driveway, our house disappearing in the rearview mirror. As we drove away, Sarah was silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. I could tell she was trying to process everything, just as I was. But as the miles stretched on and the house grew smaller in the distance, one thought kept gnawing at me. We had found the cameras. We had found the bed. We had found the notebook. But we hadn't found the intruder. They were still out there, still watching. And somehow I knew this wasn't over. When I first moved into the house, I thought it was perfect. It had the kind of charm you'd expect from an older place. A little worn, but with character. The kind of place where you could imagine a lifetime of memories being made. It sat in a quiet suburban neighborhood, far from the chaos of the city, where the streets were lined with trees, and the neighbors kept to themselves. Exactly what I needed after everything that had happened. The previous owner had left in a hurry, I was told, moving to a retirement home across the country. The house had sat empty for a while, gathering dust, but I didn't mind. I liked the idea of starting fresh, in a place where no one knew me, where I could rebuild my life at my own pace. There was something comforting about the isolation. I settled in quickly, unpacking boxes and making the space my own. The first week or so was quiet, just the sound of the wind brushing through the trees and the occasional car passing by. At night, the house creaked and groaned, but that was expected. Old houses made noise. I told myself it was just the wood settling, the pipes adjusting to being used again. Still, there was something about those sounds that left me uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. My neighbor was odd. His name was Mr. Franklin. I had only met him once, briefly, when I was moving in. He lived in the house next door, but I rarely saw him leave. From what I could tell, he was a solitary figure, someone who kept to himself. He had this way about him, a certain intensity in his eyes, like he was always watching, always thinking. Our conversation was short and awkward. I got the sense that he didn't like small talk. Then the noises started. It was subtle at first, just a soft tapping sound coming from below. It was late, probably around midnight. I had been lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A rhythmic thump, 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 like someone was tapping their fingers against the wall. I sat up, listening more closely. It seemed to be coming from the basement. I brushed it off at first. It was probably just the old pipes or the wind pushing against the house. I tried to go back to sleep, but the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. The next morning, I went down to the basement to check it out. The air down there was cold and damp, and the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long shadows across the floor. I stood still for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the soft hum of the boiler. Everything seemed normal. Maybe it had been nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But that night, the noises came back. This time, it was more than just tapping. There were muffled thuds, almost like footsteps, followed by a faint scraping sound as if something was being dragged across the floor. I got out of bed and tiptoed down to the basement again, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood at the top of the stairs, peering down into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything out of place. The sound stopped the moment I set foot on the first step. It was unsettling, to say the least. Over the next few days, the noises became more frequent. Every night around the same time, I would hear the strange tapping and thudding, always coming from the same spot in the basement. I tried everything to figure out what was causing it. I checked the pipes, inspected the foundation, even set up traps in case it was some kind of animal. But I found nothing. The basement was as still as ever during the day. One night, after being woken up by the tapping yet again, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed a flashlight and marched downstairs, determined to figure out what was going on. As I stood in the basement, the sound seemed louder, more insistent. I followed it to the far corner, where the concrete walls met the floor. That's when I noticed it. One of the wooden panels on the wall didn't look quite right. It was loose, slightly off-center, like it had been moved recently. My heart raced as I reached out and tugged at the edge of the panel. It came away easily, revealing a small, dark opening behind it. I shined the flashlight into the gap, and to my shock, there was a narrow corridor beyond, one that stretched deeper into the darkness. I crouched down, my breath catching in my throat. The corridor wasn't part of the house's original design. That much was clear. It looked old, maybe even older than the house itself, and it was eerily silent. The walls were rough and uneven, as if they had been carved out in secret. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but curiosity got the better of me. I squeezed through the opening, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as I ventured deeper into the passage. The air grew colder as I moved forward, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the narrow walls. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the end of the corridor. There was another door, this one even more worn and fragile than the panel I had removed. I pushed it open slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. I was in another basement, but this one wasn't mine. As I stepped into the room, I realized where I was. This was Mr. Franklin's house, and that's when I saw them. In the corner of the room, mounted on a desk, were rows of screens, monitors, each one connected to a camera. I stared in horror as I realized what they were showing. Every screen displayed a different angle of my house. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, my bedroom. He'd been watching me. All this time, I stood frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. The dim glow from the screens cast an eerie light across the room, making everything feel distorted, unreal. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the images playing out in front of me. Every angle of my home displayed like a twisted surveillance experiment. The living room where I spent most of my evenings, the kitchen where I made my coffee every morning, and my bedroom. The place I thought I was safe, where I slept without knowing I was being watched. Mr. Franklin had been monitoring every move I made, and I had no idea. My skin crawled at the thought, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. This wasn't just a violation, it was a nightmare. I backed away slowly, my footsteps as quiet as I could manage. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Why? Why would he do this? What could possibly drive someone to set up such an invasive system? My mind raced with questions, but I had no answers. All I knew was that I needed to get out of here. Now, as I turned to leave, a faint creak echoed through the corridor behind me, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. My blood turned to ice. I wasn't alone. I killed the flashlight immediately, plunging the room into darkness. My pulse quickened, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run. But I forced myself to stay still, to listen. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. They were coming from the passage I had just come through. It had to be him. Mr. Franklin. I crouched behind an old cabinet, my breath shallow, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps grew louder, and I could hear the faint scrape of shoes against the concrete floor. I peeked around the edge of the cabinet, just in time to see a figure enter the room. The dim light from the screen silhouetted him, but there was no mistaking the hunched, deliberate posture. It was Mr. Franklin, just as I had feared. He stopped at the door, his head tilted slightly, as if listening for something. My heart hammered in my chest, and I prayed he couldn't hear it. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity, just standing there in the doorway, his silhouette looming in the pale glow of the screens. The tension in the air was unbearable. I shifted slightly, trying to get a better view without making any noise, but my foot brushed against something on the floor, a small box I hadn't noticed before. It tipped over with a soft thud, but in the dead silence of the room, it sounded like an explosion. Mr. Franklin's head snapped toward the noise, and my heart dropped into my stomach. He moved quickly, crossing the room in a few long strides, his eyes scanning the shadows. I ducked lower, pressing myself against the cold wall, barely daring to breathe. I could hear his labored breathing, the faint wheeze of each exhale as he moved closer. Panic surged through me. I couldn't stay hidden forever. At any moment, he'd find me, and I had no idea what he would do if he caught me here. I needed to find a way out, fast. I glanced around the room, searching for an escape route. There was only one exit, the same narrow corridor I had come through. But to reach it, I'd have to get past him. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I couldn't confront him directly. I didn't know what he was capable of, and I didn't want to find out. My only option was to distract him, to create some sort of diversion. Slowly, carefully, I picked up the small box I had knocked over. It was heavier than I expected, but it would have to do. I shifted my weight, preparing to throw it across the room. If I could make enough noise, maybe I could slip past him in the confusion. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling, and hurled the box toward the far corner of the room. It crashed into the wall with a loud clatter, sending a cascade of smaller objects scattering across the floor. Mr. Franklin reacted immediately, turning toward the noise. Without hesitating, I bolted for the door. My footsteps echoed in the corridor as I ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps quickening as he realized what was happening. The narrow passage seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in on me as I sprinted toward the exit. Finally, I burst through the hidden door into my own basement, slamming it shut behind me. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, and quickly pushed a heavy shelf in front of the door, barricading it. I could hear Mr. Franklin on the other side, pounding against the wood, his voice low and guttural, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. My mind raced. What the hell was I supposed to do now? Call the police? Run? I couldn't think straight. All I knew was that I needed to get out of the house, out of this nightmare, before he found another way in. But just as I turned to head upstairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of my basement, hidden behind a pile of old furniture, was another camera. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was glaringly obvious, its small red light blinking steadily in the darkness. He had been watching me here too, watching me this whole time. I felt sick, my stomach churning with fear and disgust. How many cameras were there? How long had he been doing this? My mind spiraled as I backed away from the camera, my skin crawling. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. I pulled it out with shaking hands and saw a text message from an unknown number. "You can't hide from me." I dropped the phone, the weight of the message sinking in. Mr. Franklin wasn't just watching me, he was hunting me. I stood there, frozen, staring at the blinking red light in the corner of my basement. The reality of it hit me hard. There was no escape. Mr. Franklin had been watching me from the beginning, not just through those monitors in his basement, but right here in my own home. Every move I made, every second I thought I was safe, he had seen it all. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here any longer. But where would I go? And how could I be sure he wouldn't follow? My thoughts were racing, spiraling into panic when I heard it again. The sound of Mr. Franklin pounding against the hidden door in the basement. He was still there, still trying to get in. My barricade wouldn't hold forever. I had to make a decision. Grabbing my phone off the floor, I glanced at the chilling message one last time. "You can't hide from me." My hands shook as I dialed 911, my heart pounding in my chest. The line rang once, twice, and then a voice answered on the other end. 911, what's your emergency? I tried to explain, my voice trembling as I described the cameras, the hidden passage, Mr. Franklin watching me. But as the words came out, they sounded crazy even to me. Who would believe that my neighbor had built a secret corridor connecting our houses, that he had installed cameras all over my home? "I'm being watched," I stammered. He's in my house. He's been watching me." "I don't." The operator's calm, methodical voice cut through my panic. "Sir, please stay on the line. We're sending a unit to your location. Stay where you are and do not confront the intruder." Stay where I was? With Mr. Franklin banging at the door? There was no way I could just sit and wait for help to arrive. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but where would I go? He seemed to know every move I made. I could still hear the thudding from the hidden door in the basement, growing louder and more frantic. Mr. Franklin was relentless. How long would it take for him to break through? In a panic, I ran up the stairs, my footsteps echoing through the house. I had to get out, but I needed to think. My car keys were on the kitchen counter. If I could get to them, I could drive far enough away, call the police again, and wait for them to arrive. Maybe then I'd be safe. I sprinted into the kitchen, grabbing the keys with trembling hands. But just as I turned toward the front door, I froze. Mr. Franklin was standing there. He was inside. I hadn't heard him come in, hadn't even realized he had gotten through the hidden passage. He was just standing there, blocking the only exit, his eyes locked on mine. The look on his face was calm, almost serene, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. "You weren't supposed to find out," he said, his voice soft but firm, like a teacher scolding a child. "You were supposed to live your life, and I would observe." That was the plan. I took a step back, my mind racing. He moved forward, closing the distance between us, his eyes never leaving mine. I could feel the sweat on my skin, the adrenaline surging through me. This wasn't just about surveillance anymore. This was something much darker. Something I didn't fully understand. "I didn't want it to come to this," he said, shaking his head slowly, as if disappointed. But you just couldn't leave well enough alone." I didn't respond. My mouth was dry, and my hands trembled so much that I nearly dropped the car keys. I had to get out. I had to run, but he was blocking the only exit. Suddenly, he lunged. Instinct took over. I threw the first thing I could grab, a nearby chair, at him and darted toward the back door. I heard the chair crash against the floor, and then the sound of heavy footsteps as he came after me. I barely made it through the door before I felt his hand brush my shoulder. I ran. I didn't stop to think, didn't stop to look back. I sprinted across the yard, toward the street, my heart pounding in my chest. Every second I expected to feel his hands grab me from behind, to hear him call my name, but all I heard was my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the streetlights. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block. Only then did I dare to glance back. Mr. Franklin stood in the doorway of my house, watching. He wasn't chasing me. He just stood there, his face barely visible in the dim light, his figure dark and menacing against the backdrop of the house. He didn't need to chase me. He knew that no matter where I went, he could find me. I stumbled toward the nearest neighbor's house, pounding on the door until someone finally answered. The police arrived not long after, but by the time they searched the house, Mr. Franklin was gone. The hidden passage, the cameras, everything was still there. But he had vanished. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Even after the police assured me that Mr. Franklin had fled and that they were searching for him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. Every time I passed a window, I half expected to see his face staring back at me from the shadows. I moved out of the house soon after. I couldn't stay there anymore. The memories, the fear, it was too much. But even now, in a new city, in a new home, I can't escape the feeling that he's still out there, still watching. Maybe he found someone else to observe, or maybe he's still waiting. There's something strange about silence. It can be comforting, wrapping around you like a warm blanket, or it can stretch out, thin and brittle, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. That's the kind of silence I felt when I moved into this house. A quiet so deep, it felt like the world was holding its breath. I didn't mind it at first. After everything that had happened, the calm was exactly what I needed. The house, tucked away in the suburbs, was perfect for starting over. A modest two-bedroom place with enough space for me to feel comfortable, but not overwhelmed. The kind of place you can make your own, where no one bothers you, and you don't have to answer to anyone. After the end of my relationship, that's exactly what I was looking for. Peace, solitude, and space to rebuild myself. The days were easy enough. I worked from home, and the routine of emails, calls, and the occasional video meeting kept me busy. But it was the nights that unsettled me. When the house felt too still, too quiet, like there was something lurking in the corners, just out of sight. But that was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Or so I thought. The first time I noticed it, I was getting ready for bed. It had been a long day, and I was standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, brushing my teeth. Everything seemed normal, until I caught something in the corner of my eye, a dark shape in the reflection behind me. I turned quickly, but of course, there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight I kept on for when I got up in the middle of the night. I shook my head, laughing at myself. I'd been tired, and the light probably cast a weird shadow. Nothing to worry about. But it wasn't the last time I saw it. Over the next few days, it kept happening, always when I was in front of a mirror. At first, it was just a faint, blurry shape. Something I could explain away, a trick of the light, or maybe my eyes adjusting. But as the days passed, the shadow grew more distinct. It started to have form, a vague outline, like someone standing just behind me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was being ridiculous. But there was a part of me, a small, anxious part, that couldn't let it go. Why was I seeing this? Why only in the mirror? I started avoiding mirrors, not consciously at first, but gradually I found myself spending less time in front of them. I would brush my teeth quickly, glance at my reflection only long enough to make sure I looked presentable before heading out. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the shadow remained. Always there. Always behind me. Then came the night when I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had just gotten out of the shower, and the bathroom mirror was fogged up from the steam. As I wiped the glass clean, I saw it again. The shape, more defined this time. It was taller than before, its edges sharper, more human-like. My heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, I turned around. Nothing. I stood there, staring into the empty space behind me, the air thick and still. The bathroom light flickered just for a second, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it move. Not in the mirror this time, out in the hallway. It was quick, just a flicker of movement in the dark, but it was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. I rushed out of the bathroom, my eyes scanning the hallway, expecting to find someone, something. But again, there was nothing. I stood there for a long time, my heart racing, the silence in the house now unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, felt like something creeping closer, watching me. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just tired, that the stress of everything was getting to me. But deep down, I knew there was something else. Something that didn't belong. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things, soft, almost imperceptible noises, like someone moving through the house. I lay in bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, listening, my eyes wide open in the dark. Every time I thought I was about to drift off, I would hear it again, that faint sound, and my heart would pound in my chest. By morning, I was exhausted, but I told myself it had just been a bad night. I went about my day as usual, and that trying to push the thoughts of the shadow to the back of my mind. But as the day went on, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more and more, checking the mirrors, the windows, even the reflective surfaces of the kitchen appliances. The shadow was everywhere, always just out of sight, always lurking. It was no longer confined to the mirrors. It was here, in the house, with me. It didn't take long for the feeling of unease to consume me. What had started as a faint shadow in the mirror was now becoming something much more real, much harder to ignore. I told myself over and over that it was just my imagination, that stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew better. Something was in my house. The worst part wasn't just the shadow itself, it was how it seemed to follow me. It wasn't confined to the mirrors anymore, no. It had started showing up in other places, where there were no reflections. At first, it was subtle. A shape I'd catch out of the corner of my eye as I walked through the living room, or a flicker in the hallway as I passed by. Each time, I would freeze, my heart hammering in my chest, and I would turn to look. But when I did, there was nothing. Days turned into nights, and the strange occurrences only intensified. Every time I thought I saw the shadow, it seemed more defined, more solid. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, became impossible to ignore. It was always there, lingering in the edges of my vision, never fully revealing itself, but never truly gone either. One evening, after a long day of trying to push these thoughts out of my head, I finally collapsed onto the couch, hoping to lose myself in a mindless TV show. For a few minutes, it worked. I could almost forget the heaviness in the air, the oppressive silence that seemed to creep into the house after dark. But as I stared blankly at the screen, I noticed movement. At first, I thought it was a reflection in the TV, but when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't coming from the screen at all. It was behind me. I turned slowly, my muscles tense, expecting to see nothing, as usual. But this time, there was something. A figure, dark and indistinct, stood at the far end of the hallway, its shape blurry, like smoke caught in a beam of light. I froze, unable to breathe, unable to move. The figure didn't come closer, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I blinked, and in an instant, it was gone. The hallway was empty again, as if it had never been there. I sat on the couch, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But there was no logic, no explanation. All I knew was that it had been real. For the first time, I was sure of it. I couldn't just sit there anymore. I had to do something. I needed to know what was happening, what this thing was, and why it was haunting me. I spent the next few hours pacing the house, checking every room, every closet, every corner, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything out of the ordinary, no strange footprints or marks on the walls, just the same empty house I had been living in for months. But the feeling of being watched, never left. That night I barely slept. I kept waking up, heart pounding, convinced that I had heard footsteps outside my bedroom door, or that I had seen something moving in the darkness. Each time I would sit up, holding my breath, listening to the silence, straining to hear anything out of place. But all I ever heard was my own breathing, the occasional creak of the house settling, and then, just as I was about to drift off again, I heard it. A faint whisper, like the sound of someone breathing just behind me. I sat up so quickly that I nearly fell out of bed. My eyes darted to the mirror across the room, half expecting to see the shadow standing there. But the mirror was empty. The room was empty. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the sound had been too real, too close. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching me as I slept. I was on edge for days after that, jumping at every small sound, every shadow that passed by the windows. I started avoiding the mirrors entirely, keeping my back to them whenever possible. But it didn't help. The presence, the shadow, was always there, lurking in the background, watching. One evening, just after sunset, I sat on the floor of the living room, trying to focus on a book, anything to take my mind off what was happening. But the room felt too quiet, too still. I glanced up, and without thinking, my eyes flicked to the window. And there it was. The shadow was standing outside, just beyond the glass, its outline barely visible in the fading light. My heart stopped. It wasn't in the house anymore. It was outside, but somehow that made it even worse. It was there, watching me through the window, standing perfectly still. I wanted to run, to get out of the house, to leave everything behind. But my legs wouldn't move. I just sat there, staring at it, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, waiting. I forced myself to blink, and in that split second, it was gone. I was shaking as I stood up, backing away from the window. Whatever was happening, whatever this shadow was, it wasn't going away. It was getting closer, more present, more real with each passing day. I wasn't safe in my own home anymore. The walls, the mirrors, even the windows, they were all places for it to hide, to watch me. I had no idea how much worse it would get. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the constant sense of being watched, it was driving me to the edge. The shadow had become a part of my life, an ever-present, creeping figure that haunted every moment, awake or asleep. No matter what I did, where I went, it was always there, hovering just beyond reach, just out of sight, but always watching. I knew I couldn't stay in the house anymore. The sense of dread that filled every room was suffocating. I could feel the shadow closing in, becoming more tangible, more real with each passing day. I had tried to ignore it, to rationalize it away, but that was no longer possible. It was here, and it wasn't going to leave. That night, after another sleepless evening, spent staring at the ceiling, listening for the faintest noise, I decided I needed to confront it. I didn't know how or what I was supposed to do, but I knew I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. The shadow had moved beyond the mirrors and the windows. It was now in the house. Everywhere I turned, I could feel it watching, just waiting for the right moment. It was around midnight when I heard it again. The soft, whispering sound, like a breath against the back of my neck. I froze in bed, my pulse racing, my eyes scanning the darkness. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, like the very atmosphere had shifted. And then I saw it. The shadow wasn't in the mirror anymore. It wasn't outside the window, lurking in the corners of my vision. It was standing at the foot of my bed. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the figure. This time it wasn't indistinct, wasn't just a blur or a vague shape. It was clear now, almost fully formed, a tall, dark figure, its features obscured but undeniably human-like. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. Panic surged through me. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of the house, to escape. But my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, rooted to the spot as the shadow loomed closer. And then it took a step forward. I gasped, my heart hammering in my chest. It was coming closer, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. I could see its outline more clearly now, the way it seemed to shift and flicker like smoke, yet solid enough to be real. Another step. The shadow was almost at the side of the bed now. My mind raced, trying to come up with something, anything, to stop it. But there was nothing. I was trapped. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the worst. I could feel its presence right beside me, the air around me growing colder, more oppressive. My skin prickled, and every hair on my body stood on end. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was wait. But then, nothing. Slowly I opened my eyes, expecting to see the shadow standing over me, ready to strike. But the room was empty. The shadow was gone. I sat up, my body trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it all in my head? But the cold, the feeling of dread, it had been real. I knew it had been. I got out of bed, my legs shaky, and stumbled toward the mirror across the room. I had to know. I had to see if the shadow was still there. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection, waiting for it to appear. But nothing happened. The room was silent, the reflection empty. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm. Maybe it was over. Maybe the shadow had finally left me. But just as I turned to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye. Movement in the reflection. My heart stopped. I turned back to the mirror, my eyes wide with terror. And there it was. The shadow standing behind me again. But this time it wasn't just watching. It was reaching for me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. The shadow was still there, closer now, its dark, indistinct hand outstretched, as if trying to touch me through the glass. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my throat. The shadow's hand pressed against the surface of the mirror, and for a moment I thought I saw the glass ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. My pulse quickened as I backed away, my eyes locked on the reflection. The shadow wasn't just a part of the mirror anymore. It was trying to cross over. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, had to leave this house before it was too late. But as I turned to run, I felt it. A cold, clammy hand brushing against my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, silent, but I knew I wasn't alone. The mirror. I had to cover the mirror. In a frenzy, I grabbed the nearest blanket and threw it over the mirror, my hands shaking as I tried to block out the sight of the shadow. But I knew it wasn't enough. The shadow wasn't confined to the mirror anymore. It was here, in the house, with me. For the next few hours, I sat in the corner of my bedroom, curled up with my back against the wall, watching the door, waiting for the shadow to make its next move. But it never came. The silence in the house was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel the weight of the shadow's presence, even though I couldn't see it. I knew it was there, watching, waiting. Morning came, but the fear didn't leave me. I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to leave. The shadow had taken over my life, and no matter where I went, I knew it would follow. It wasn't just in the house. It was a part of me now. And as I packed my bags, ready to flee this nightmare, I caught one last glimpse of the mirror, the blanket covering it fluttering slightly in the breeze. I froze. The blanket fell to the floor, revealing the mirror once again. And there, in the reflection, was the shadow. It smiled. Living alone wasn't supposed to be this unsettling. I'd always imagined it would be peaceful. Quiet evenings to myself, free from the noise and demands of others. That's what I had craved when I moved into this house. A quaint little place, tucked away in a sleepy neighborhood. The kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happens. At least, that's what I thought. For the first few weeks, it was everything I had hoped for. The days were calm, filled with routine, working from home, tending to small chores, and enjoying the solitude. At night, I'd curl up with a book or binge-watch TV, with only the gentle hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors keeping me company. It was serene. But then, one night, everything changed. It started with the door. I was in bed reading when I heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The front door creaked open. I froze, the book slipping from my hands onto the comforter. I strained my ears, listening for any further sounds, but there was nothing. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe the wood settling. After all, it was an old house. Still, the sound had been so distinct, so real. I hesitated for a few moments before finally getting up, grabbing my phone and padding down the stairs. The front door was closed, locked in fact, just as I had left it. I sighed in relief, chastising myself for overreacting. It had to be the house. Old houses made noises, I reminded myself. I checked the locks one last time and went back upstairs. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning, listening to the house creak and groan around me. The next night, it happened again. I had just turned off the lights and was drifting off to sleep when I heard it, clearer this time. The door opened with that same creaking sound, followed by a soft thud as if it had been gently closed. I shot up in bed, heart pounding, every muscle tense. I reached for my phone, fumbling with the flashlight, and crept down the stairs. Again, the door was closed, locked. No sign of anything unusual. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, trying to calm my racing heart. It didn't make sense. There was no one here, no reason for the door to make that noise. But the sound had been so clear, so vivid. I checked the windows, making sure everything was secure, and returned to bed, determined to forget about it. But the pattern continued. Night after night, the door would creak open, followed by that faint sound of it closing. Sometimes I would hear it as I was falling asleep. Other times it woke me in the middle of the night. Always the same sound, always followed by the same eerie silence. I started avoiding the front door after dark, as if not acknowledging it would make the noises stop. But it didn't. The sound became a nightly occurrence, something I almost came to expect. And then one night, something changed. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke to the familiar creak of the door. But this time there was something different. A second sound followed, the soft, deliberate pad of footsteps in the hallway. My heart leaped into my throat. I lay there, frozen in place, listening. The footsteps were slow, measured, as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts flooding in at once. Had someone broken in? Was I imagining it? I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. The footsteps continued, growing fainter as they moved further down the hallway. My skin prickled with fear. I was alone, wasn't I? My mind fought against the possibility, trying to rationalize it, but the sound of those footsteps, so real, so deliberate, was impossible to ignore. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed my phone from the bedside table and slid out of bed. The hallway was dark, too dark, but I forced myself to take a step forward. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I crept toward the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears, and flipped on the light. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just like it always was. No intruder, no sign of anyone. Just the same old hallway I had walked down 1,000 times before. But the tension in the air lingered, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. Something wasn't right. I checked the door again. Locked. I checked the windows, the back door, Everything was secure, but the footsteps, they had been so real. I stood there for what felt like hours, my eyes darting around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. But there was no one. The house was empty. I was alone. At least I hoped I was. The days following that night blurred together in a haze of paranoia. No matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. During the day, everything felt normal enough. Sunlight filtering through the windows, the sounds of birds chirping outside, the faint hum of the neighborhood going about its quiet business. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, everything changed. The nights had become unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old wooden walls sent a chill through me. I started leaving the lights on in every room, telling myself it was just to help me feel safe. But I knew better. The shadows were getting closer. I couldn't ignore the footsteps anymore. Each night they came back, slow and deliberate, pacing just outside my bedroom door. And every time I worked up the courage to investigate, there was nothing. No one. The front door was always locked, the windows secure, and yet the sounds continued. Then came the night when everything escalated. It was a Tuesday. I had spent the entire day trying to push the strange occurrences out of my mind, throwing myself into work, cleaning the house, and distracting myself with anything I could think of. But as night fell, the familiar tension settled in. I was dreading bedtime, knowing that I would be forced to endure the same eerie routine, the door opening, the footsteps, the oppressive feeling of being watched. That night, I decided to stay downstairs, hoping that maybe being closer to the door would help me confront whatever was happening. Maybe if I could catch it in the act, I could finally put an end to this nightmare. I made myself a cup of tea and settled on the couch, pulling a blanket over my legs as I stared at the front door. The house was too quiet. My mind kept playing tricks on me, convincing me I was hearing faint noises, like whispers just beyond the walls. I checked the clock. 11:47 p.m. Too early for the strange sounds to start, right? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and then it happened. The door creaked open. The sound was louder this time, unmistakable. My heart raced as I stared at the door, frozen in place. I could hear it clearly, the door swinging on its hinges, followed by the soft thud of it closing. But this time, there was something different. A new sound followed, one that made my blood run cold. The faint squelch of wet footsteps. I bolted upright on the couch, my hands trembling. My mind raced. No, this couldn't be happening. But the sound was so real, so vivid. The footsteps were coming closer, the squelching growing louder, as if someone were walking through mud, dragging their feet along the wooden floors. I grabbed my phone, shining the light toward the hallway, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I stared at the beam of light, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway was empty, except for the footprints. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly walked toward the hallway. The light from my phone illuminated the floor, revealing a trail of muddy footprints stretching from the front door, down the hallway, and stopping just outside my bedroom. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. The prints were fresh, the mud still wet and dark against the floorboards. I knelt down, reaching out to touch one of the prints. The mud smeared under my fingers, cool and damp. This was real. Someone or something had been inside my house. I stood up quickly, my pulse racing. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this house, to call the police, to do anything other than stand here paralyzed with fear. But I couldn't move. Something in the air felt wrong, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I looked toward the front door. It was closed, but the footprints led directly from it. Had someone come inside and then vanished? It didn't make sense. The door was locked, but the prints were there, clear as day. I backed away from the hallway, my eyes darting around the room. I needed to think. I needed to. A sudden creak interrupted my thoughts. I turned toward the sound, my heart skipping a beat. The door was open. It had happened again, without a sound, without warning. The front door had opened, but this time I saw it with my own eyes. It stood ajar, the soft glow of the porch light spilling into the dark hallway, my stomach twisted with dread. I wanted to run, to get out, but I was rooted to the spot, and then the footsteps returned. Slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway, approaching the living room where I stood. My legs trembled, and I backed away, unable to take my eyes off the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could hear the wet squelch of mud on the floorboards again. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The door slammed shut. I jumped, dropping my phone, the light spinning across the room as it hit the floor. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. I scrambled to pick it up, shining the light back toward the hallway. But once again, there was nothing. No one. The muddy footprints were still there, leading from the door to the hallway, as if someone had walked right through and disappeared into thin air. The air in the house was thick with tension, as though I had just missed something important, something terrifying. I grabbed my phone and ran upstairs, locking myself in my bedroom. My hands shook as I texted a friend, desperate for some reassurance, for someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. But the truth was, I knew something was terribly wrong. The footsteps weren't in my head, they were real. And whoever, or whatever, was making them, was getting closer. I don't know how long I stayed in my room that night, my back pressed against the door, heart hammering in my chest. Every shadow felt like a threat, every creak of the house a prelude to something far worse. The footprints, the door, the sound of those wet, deliberate footsteps. It was all too real. Something had been in my house, and I wasn't sure if it had left. The night stretched on, endless and silent. My phone buzzed with a few missed messages, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. What could I even say? How do you explain to someone that you're being haunted by something that doesn't make sense? Something that vanishes the moment you try to confront it? I must have drifted off at some point, my exhaustion overpowering the fear, because when I opened my eyes again, the room was dark. The only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside my window. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe the nightmare had passed, and I could finally leave this house and never look back. But as I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I heard it again. The door. The unmistakable creak, followed by the soft click as it swung shut. My heart stopped. The footsteps followed, slow and heavy, but this time, they were different. They weren't coming from the hallway. They were right outside my bedroom door. I froze, barely breathing, listening as the sound of those wet, squelching steps approached, stopping just on the other side of the door. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then, slowly, a shadow stretched across the floor beneath the doorframe. Someone was standing there. My stomach twisted in fear, and I inched away from the door, my back pressing up against the wall. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The shadow remained, looming just outside the room, as if waiting for something, waiting for me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I could feel the cold sweat running down my spine, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The door wasn't locked. If whoever was out there wanted to come in, they could. I stared at the handle, praying it wouldn't turn, praying that whatever was standing outside would go away. And then the handle moved. It was subtle at first, a slow twist, but it was unmistakable. My heart leaped into my throat, and I bolted upright, backing away from the door as far as I could. The door creaked open just an inch, and the shadow deepened. The air in the room turned cold, thick with dread. And then I saw him. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint glow from the hallway, was a man. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, his outline barely visible in the darkness, but unmistakable. My pulse pounded in my ears, every instinct screaming at me to run, to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at the figure in the doorway. He didn't step forward. He didn't speak. He simply watched, standing there like he had all the time in the world, as if waiting for me to make the first move. I felt my chest tighten, panic rising in my throat. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911, but my hand slipped, the phone clattering to the floor with a loud thud. And then the man moved. In one slow, deliberate motion, he stepped into the room, his footsteps eerily silent now, as if the very sound had been sucked out of the air. I backed away, my heart racing, my mind scrambling for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. He stopped just a few feet from the bed, his face still obscured by the shadows. I could barely make out his features, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. The silence was deafening, the tension unbearable. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, choking on the fear that gripped me. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes, the way he stood there, unmoving, unblinking, told me everything I needed to know. He had been here all along. I felt the room closing in on me, the walls pressing in as I tried to understand what was happening, tried to rationalize the impossible. But there was no rationality left. The muddy footprints, the door that opened and closed on its own, the strange presence I had felt night after night, it had all led to this moment. The man took another step forward. I scrambled backward, my back hitting the wall. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind screaming at me to do something, but I was paralyzed, trapped in the suffocating grip of terror. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned. Without a word, without even looking back, he walked toward the door, his footsteps once again heavy and deliberate. He stepped into the hallway, and for a moment I thought he was leaving. I thought maybe it was over. But then he stopped. He turned his head, just slightly, enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face in the dim light. He smiled, and then he was gone. The door creaked shut behind him, the sound echoing through the empty house like a final warning. I sat there, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to believe it was over, that he was gone. But deep down, I knew the truth. He would be back.